The blue state exodus is upon us. As Democrat leaders continue to bungle their response to COVID-19, Americans are voting with their feet, fleeing in record numbers to red states. Friends, it's time for Hold the Line.
Today, I will be signing an executive order that will carefully and responsibly increase indoor capacities at a number of our businesses and venues from 25% to 35%. And this order will take effect at 8 a.m. this Friday, February 5th.
Welcome to Hold the Line. I'm Buck Sexton. That was New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy announcing an increase in indoor capacity for restaurants and businesses around his state. Why not 40%, by the way? Why 35%? The increase is a welcome development, but it's cold comfort to the estimated 1/3 of small businesses in the Garden State that have been forced to permanently close their doors due to COVID-19 restrictions. Same scene is playing out in Democrat-run states around the nation. Small businesses suffer while waiting for state and local officials to give them permission to reopen. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom, once praised for his leadership during the pandemic, is now underwater with his own constituents. A new poll released this week by the University of California, Berkeley, found that 43% of Californians now believe that Newsom has done a poor job in handling the COVID crisis. Failure of leadership and Democratic policies is responsible, at least in part, for Americans seeking refuge in red states, most notably Florida and Texas. According to a report from the New York Times, nearly 1,000 people are moving to the Sunshine State every single day. The migration is due in no small part to the contrasting approach taken by Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. And friends, we know that the Founding Fathers set up this government in such a way that the states would be laboratories of our democracy, that there would be different policies and different places tried, and that the American people could pick and choose, well, where do I want to go? Which state is being well run? And if you look at the last 12 months, when it has really mattered what state you live in, it's mattered to your day-to-day freedom, whether your business has been able to continue on or not. For a lot of people, it's a question of whether or not the state forced them to go bankrupt, ruin their life's work. It mattered what state you were in. And when you look at the results, redder states like Florida that have large populations, you got to compare things that are somewhat alike. Wyoming and California is not a fair comparison, right? But Florida and California is fair. Florida, New York, Florida, New Jersey is also fair, and you could throw Texas in there too. And the states that tried to keep a greater balance between openness and lockdowns, between the concerns of the business and just day-to-day life communities and the health risks out there, they did better. And people are, as we said, voting with their feet. They're moving, and they're not moving to New York. They're not moving to California. They're leaving those places. And those are Democrat strongholds. As you know, there's one-party rule. It's Democrat rule in New York, New Jersey, and California. And New York and New Jersey have the single worst responses to COVID-19 on a per capita basis when you look at overall deaths in the state of any place in the whole country. In fact, among the worst rates per 100,000 residents of anywhere in the whole world. And meanwhile, down in Florida, they're relatively open. Businesses, I've been down there, I've seen it, they've got businesses opened. And Governor Ron DeSantis, who people are already talking about a lot as a possible 2024 contender, he's continuing to lead by talking about how not only is he going to protect the business interests and the ability to earn a living for Floridians, while also doing a better job than other comparable big states in getting the vaccine out to people, but he wants to take on big tech. Here's what the governor had to say in a speech that's gotten a lot of buzz.
At the turn of the 21st century, online technology represented tools to liberate Americans from reliance on distrusted legacy media outlets. As social media proliferated over the past decade, citizens could directly connect with large numbers of people and could cut out corporate media outlets entirely. Over the years, however, these platforms have changed from neutral platforms that provided Americans with the freedom to speak to enforcers of preferred narratives. Consequently, these platforms have played an increasingly decisive role in elections and have negatively impacted Americans who dissent from orthodoxies favored by the big tech cartel.
You know what Governor DeSantis is telling people now? That he will open it up so that in his state, You can sue if you are mistreated by the social media companies under the laws of the state of Florida. He wants there to be legislation so that you can actually bring essentially a political discrimination suit against big tech in his state. This is what we need to see. States that are taking it upon themselves to protect constitutional rights. When the federal government fails, or when the federal government is in fact the transgressor on those rights, to try to create safe havens, to try to create places where you can still enjoy those constitutionally protected freedoms when the federal government is falling down on the job. That also means lawsuits. That means taking things to court. One of the great legacies of the Trump administration is that you have a whole lot more constitutionalist judges in the federal judiciary all the way up to the Supreme Court than you did before Trump's first 4 years, or Trump's 4 years in office, rather. So Governor Ron DeSantis is not only doing a better job than his peers, other governors across the country, with the way he's handled COVID, he's also taking a leadership role in creating Florida as a beacon of freedom that the rest of the country can look at and say, hold on a second, you mean if I live in that state, I can live my life, I have some due process protections, and I'm going to be governed in a more sane fashion than if I live in one of these, let's be honest, one of these blue state hellholes. I'm in New York City, I'll say it. Same thing for my friends in San Francisco, increasingly the same thing in Los Angeles. People see what's going on. It's crazy town. We all know it. Or they can just do what they always do. Blame somebody else. In this case, you know what the best go-to is? The teachers' unions. Let's just take this one for a second. As you know, they won't go back to school. It's sheer power play, laziness. It's awful that what the teachers' unions are doing. They're making kids suffer. But they're all Democrats, and they're a huge Democrat constituency. And they won't allow for, you can't really reopen unless you got the public school system open in any major population center. So what does the Democrat mayor of Chicago say? It's Trump's fault.
Look, this is a very difficult situation. And we're in it still because of the incompetence of the previous administration. So I think it's important for both sides to come to the table in good faith, recognize that we're both trying to work through a very challenging situation, but we must get a deal done. So I've tried to say, let's cool down, let's lower the temperature, but let's focus on bridging the divide in the remaining issues so we can get a deal done.
Yeah. The all-Democrat teachers unions in the all-Democrat-controlled cities of cities like Chicago, it's Trump's fault they refuse to go back to the classroom because Trump traumatized them so much? Give me a break. Take some responsibility, libs. Just a little bit, just some. All right, next up, we'll take a closer look at the disastrous response to COVID-19 by New York Governor Andrew Cuomo with our friend New York City Council member Joe Borelli. That's up next. Have you ever wanted to invest in real estate, but you didn't have the time to do it on your own? I felt exactly the same way as you until about a year ago. I've always loved the idea of real estate investments, but I didn't know how to get started in real estate investing, especially when I got all these other obligations. I'm sure you're really busy too. Where do you begin? Well, that's when I met my friends at Done For You Real Estate. They took all the guesswork, all that early stage anxiety out of it for me. They found me an awesome property. They rented it out for me right away. In fact, they got a tenant in the week I closed, and they manage the tenant for me now. I just get a check every month like clockwork. Don't wait another second to see if my buddies at Done For You Real Estate can do for you what they did for me. Visit doneforyoubuck.com to see how this works. Again, that's doneforyoubuck.com to begin your real estate investment journey.
When I say experts in air quotes, it sounds like I'm saying I don't really trust the experts, because I don't.
Almighty King Cuomo continues the blame game. This time he's pointing fingers at his own New York State health officials. During Friday's press conference, the cool guy governor admitted to not trusting the experts, but I thought that was about the science, right? Following it? No. While Cuomo was busy receiving an Emmy Award and writing his COVID leadership biography in the middle of a pandemic entitled Lessons of Leadership, the experts on the front lines were planning their mass exodus. At least 9 top New York health officials have resigned, retired, or been reassigned. The most common denominator when they were asked about this? Dissatisfaction with the governor's handling of the pandemic. Shocker. Here to weigh in, New York City Councilman Joe Borelli, who is fighting for the rights of New Yorkers and all Americans to actually get their lives back at some point here. Joe, good to see you.
I thought you were going to do the councilman.
I mean, from what I understand, this is now Cuomo speak for. He's got a new version of events that he wants to share, because it had been listen to the science or else you're a bad person. But now when Cuomo doesn't want to listen to the science, he makes funny jokes about how they're not really experts. What has happened here? Because it does feel like there's a shift away from the Cuomo adoration in the media. My theory has been, do they just want to see Letitia James become the new, governor of New York, or can they just not prop him up anymore? Why are we seeing articles all of a sudden that are telling people what you and I have known all along?
Yeah. Well, look, the floodgates definitely opened, and when the pendulum comes back, it comes back hard, especially when the media unnecessarily, propped this guy up for so long. I mean, the media propped this guy up because they were so blinded by, the anti-Trump notion that they govern their editorial rooms with, that they were just so happy to see someone who seemingly had a situation under control. Now, anyone in New York knew that was fundamentally not true. Anyone in New York knew that people were dying at a higher rate. Things were going poorly. The budget was ballooning. The deficit was growing. All these things were happening, and yet the media propped him up. Now, I mean, if you want to know just how the new steps of things are going, so 48 hours ago, Governor Cuomo said, there's no way we're going to consider vaccinating restaurant workers, even though we're opening things up. He actually criticized people who suggested it. He said it was an unserious conversation. Literally 24 hours after saying that, very publicly, making a big stink, he said, actually, we're gonna start vaccinating some of the workers. This is a guy that just, every time you look for the rationale behind what he's doing, he says it's about the science, he says it's about the metrics, but it always shows that it's about the politics and his image. This is a guy who loves self-aggrandizing himself, whether it's books, whether it's receiving an Emmy Award on behalf of his work, or my favorite is the self-aggrandizing posters he made about himself. Now, there are leaders, Buck, around the world who make posters of themselves celebrating their success on the field of battle or on the field of science. We wouldn't normally consider them democratically elected, officials.
Yeah, this is not Pyongyang. This is still New York, from what I understand.
So there you go. You have the Cuomo posters right up next to your Che poster, right up next to your Kim Jong-un poster. Now you can put your Cuomo, COVID mountain poster. It's obscene.
He was tweeting out in May, look at the data, follow the science, listen to the experts, be smart. One thing that I've been trying to tell people along here is that the way you interpret the data and the judgments you come to from the data is where the policy discussion happens. But people like Cuomo, to justify whatever they were doing, have taken the approach all along, Joe, of, no, I know what the science says. But it turns out with these advisors, these 9 science advisors who have left, and all because of him, basically, and we should also let folks know at home that Cuomo has a horrible just personal reputation to work with. I think that also factors into this. But the scientists around him, or the people that were health experts, were saying, this guy's a nightmare. So he's Mr. Science, except actual scientists can't stand to be around him.
And he was called out by the New York Times in a story yesterday as well. I mean, so he picked the highest date of positivity rate and the lowest date of positivity rate to try to falsely say that the rate of COVID infections has gone down, and that's why we're opening New York City restaurants. But if you actually expanded that list to the 7-day averages, you would see the chart he should have been showing says exactly the opposite. And that New York City, which I'm glad they're opening, but they're opening restaurants when we're doing far worse than when we actually close them, which is an insane thing to say if you're also trying to argue the case that you're the person who has data behind them, you're the person who has the metrics behind them.
And this is really important, because one of the ways that we weren't able to have what I would call an adult conversation, this is true across the country, New York has become a microcosm of this, but it's true in a lot of places, was that anytime you brought up the need to open, even if there could be some additional risk, we all understand there's risk in life, but the need to reopen so that you don't destroy entire business sectors, not even just individual businesses, you were told you were a monster who didn't care about grandma and grandpa dying and just shut up and listen to the science. Now people that were taking that position, including Cuomo himself, are saying, yeah, we're not going to have any restaurants left unless we reopen. So even though, as you point out, things are worse now, let's open up those restaurants. Gee, I feel like maybe we're owed an apology, Joe.
not only do we owe an apology, but like it's crazy to see some of the reporters who are paid to cover him actually try to vouch for the crazy stuff he's been saying. And look, he's been wrong on this idea of reopening for so long. Whether it's comparing New York to Florida, obviously Florida stayed open. There's a steeper decline in cases right now in Florida than there is in New York, and we haven't opened the restaurants yet. My favorite example, though, is Arizona. I mean, Arizona was chastised for being a state of baby killers. But if you look at Southern California, right next door, where they have literally locked down everything, had stay-at-home orders, the rate in California, Southern California at least, was higher than Arizona. So this has never made sense from the beginning. And whereas the governor would have gotten a lot of leeway, a lot of gray area, a lot of passes in the beginning, in March and in April for being too strong and locking things down, when you realize this wasn't working one bit and you were bankrupting the state, selling off future generations of New Yorkers, making current New Yorkers want to leave, maybe it was time to really focus on reopening.
Do we have any real sense of how many now over the last 12 months have left New York for warmer, redder places?
Look, I mean, Cuomo's certainly a Realtor of the Year in Florida and North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Arizona. You name it. He's probably sending more people there than the fine folks at RE/MAX. But, I mean, there is a number we typically use. It's been over 1 million people. That was the number going into the pandemic. I mean, going into the pandemic, in his 10-year tenure, 1 million people more have left the state for other states in the United States than people have let in. Now we know, just from the data from van line companies and things like that, and we'll see the numbers actually very soon from the census, but more people have left this year than even in years past. It's palatable where I live. It's palatable, Buck, where you live. And we're seeing it in the street where New York City begins to look like a ghost town.
No, it's definitely palpable in my neighborhood. I mean, the streets are empty in Midtown, and they're giving away 3 months rent in New York, which, as you know, if you're renting, this is like unheard of before. Certainly going all the way back to the aftermath of 9/11, you haven't had anything like this in the city before. Are we approaching a reopen that's durable in a place like? I know we're focusing a lot on this, and people watch us from all over the country, but as New York goes, California, Michigan, Illinois, these other blue states are gonna trend in that same direction. Do you think that the politicians that have been making these decisions realize that we really have to reopen and it has to be for real this time?
Yeah, I think Governor Cuomo is actually now being led by some of the smaller Democratic governors. I mean, right across the river from me and you in New Jersey, Governor Murphy, who's been a bit more aggressive on reopening than Cuomo, announced that restaurants are going to not have any more curfew, 10 o'clock curfew. I got kicked out of a restaurant in Jersey, by the way, this weekend at 9:59. I couldn't even finish my salmon, but there was a very strict curfew. Governor Murphy has eliminated that. He's upping the capacity at restaurants around Super Bowl Sunday. So right now, it's just, again, where, Murphy and others are a step ahead. You go to Connecticut, you go to Pennsylvania, you go down to Maryland. Any state in this region seems to be doing a much better job, a much more aggressive job than Governor Cuomo. And he's losing that money. Like I said, the Borelli family and our pals, we rented a van. We drove across the bridge. We still had a wonderful night. We're still going out. We're still living our life. We're just not doing it in any of our restaurants here on Staten Island.
COVID is something we got to continue to struggle to get past, my friend. Hopefully we've learned some lessons here. Joe Borelli, good to see you, man. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
So there's another epidemic gripping the U.S. Since last year, cities around the country have seen a huge surge in violent crime. So what's behind the crime wave? We'll investigate in tonight's Buck Brief. I bet you never thought COVID could cost you your home, right? Well, it just might, because cybercrime's up 75%. And when it comes to your home, the most serious cybercrime that you have to worry about by far is home title theft. That's right, cyber criminals, foreign and domestic, are now after our homes, and it's a lot easier than you'd think. The title documents to our homes are online now. The thief finds your home's title and forges your signature on a quitclaim deed stating you sold your home to him. Then he takes out loans on your home and leaves you with the debts. You won't know until late payment notices or perhaps even an eviction notice arrives. And insurance doesn't cover you, neither do common identity theft programs. That's why I protect my home with Home Title Lock. The instant Home Title Lock detects someone tampering with my home's title, they help shut it down. Go to HometitleLock.com and register your address to see if you're already a victim of this crime and don't even know it yet. You can also use code RADIO to receive 30 free days of protection. That's code radio at HomeTitleLock.com. Again, code radio at HomeTitleLock.com. A major story going underreported by the media is the nationwide surge in crime, particularly violent crime. This is a phenomenon not seen since the 1980s crack epidemic, but what's fueling this surge in criminality over the last 12 months? There's no new major drug hitting the streets of American cities after all, though we are in the midst of still a terrible opioid overdose crisis. Could it be, though, the economic collapse spurred on by the COVID lockdowns coupled with rising political and racial tensions has created an environment of lawlessness to creep in, especially in these large urban areas? Would it be crazy to even suggest that? Well, it seems that our political leaders want to dig their heads into the sand and pretend that their actions, or lack thereof, not having any major impact on communities across the country. How can people live happy, productive lives when the ever-present threat of being violently attacked on the streets is getting worse all the time? Let's investigate further in today's Buck Brief. Now, there is some seasonality to crime data, for example, worth noting that. You tend to have fewer shootings in highly populated areas in the wintertime than you do in the summertime. So keep in mind that this is not a constant all throughout the year. There'll be peaks and valleys in the crime rate, but it's important to pay attention to this. And when you look at homicides per 100,000 of city population, you will see that, and you can kind of see on your screen, see that huge jump up. Now, that's after the pandemic, but it's also a little bit after the pandemic started, when things started to reopen and something else happened, which we will go to in a moment. But just understand that there was a big spike in murders. I mean, the most serious of crimes. There was a big spike in murders last year, and it started after the pandemic. Right about 3 or 4 months, you could tell it really got going. When you look at this city by city, the data becomes even more clear. Murder up 36.7% in 57 cities. Murders up in 51 of 57 overall. And this is the 57 largest cities in the country. 37 of 58 cities reporting murder up more than 30%. So basically, this is something we haven't seen in decades. Major urban centers saw big jumps in homicides. The thing about homicides is not only is it, of course, considered the most serious crime, but also that's hard data. It's tough to cover up a homicide. People tend to know about it, and it's a firm number that you can gather together. And so when you see that spiking up the way that it has, people understandably get very concerned. I know even here in New York City, where I've been during the entirety of the pandemic, there have been a lot more shootings, 3-digit percentage-wise increase in shootings over the last 12 months. And with that also an increase in homicides. The NYPD, I was speaking about this just a second ago, says that murders and shootings are up in New York City. It's not just a spike. We're in uncharted waters, according to one analyst, and in Insider.com. New York City murders are up by 33%, and the number of victims shot has doubled. Doubled! That's not something anybody would have expected, especially given you have to remember that during the pandemic there are far fewer people on the streets, far fewer people in public accommodations, in bars, nightclubs, restaurants, interacting with each other on the subway, in traffic, and yet shootings have doubled? Why is that? We'll address the why question in a moment, or at least one aspect of how we got to the why. And there's a former NYPD analyst, I'm a former NYPD analyst for what that's worth, says COVID-19, political unrest, and economic depression are playing a role in the data. Well, yeah, that's a lot of things. I got another thing that I want to... Political unrest. When you mean political unrest, these days it, of course, refers to the Trump insurrection that the media keeps pretending is going to happen at any moment. But was there other political unrest last summer that happened? Anyone remember anything? Was some political unrest that was going on? And right around the time when there was a big spike in murders. We'll get to that. Did the BLM protests against the police lead to this 2020 homicide spike? This is in Quillette, where they ask questions that the rest of the liberal media, or that the liberal media does not want people to ask, certainly, or answer. And if you look at a chart in Chicago, the stay-at-home order, the start of protests, you can start to see that there's certainly a correlation, not necessarily a causation, with the start of the protests and the big spike, because the stay-at-home order went into effect. So that's when COVID goes. You see that first line there? That's the stay-at-home order. The second line, that big spike that happens, the actual shooting, that's the red line. That's when the protests start. So here's at least one place. Chicago, as you know, has a very high rate of homicides per capita. It's a shame. It's a tragedy what happens in that city day in and day out. But you can see here, their usual homicide number spikes up right after the BLM protests start. Now, isn't that so strange? Because we were told by the media constantly that Black Lives Matter were mostly peaceful protests that were about justice and that weren't about anarchy, hatred of police, and just excusing rage and disorder in the streets. It was about justice. Why would there be more murders at a time when there are mostly peaceful protests going on? That's a question that I think we should all answer. You remember some of the scenes that you saw here. And you should also know there's something called the Ferguson Effect. Ferguson was the first ever, that was the first incident that led to a Black Lives Matter movement. That was under the Obama administration. And then when we looked at the data, criminologists and people who study the sociological effects of changes in police behavior came up with this notion and popularized by Heather McDonald of the Ferguson Effect, which is that cops won't do their jobs the same way when they don't have society's backing to do them. And then that results in an emboldened class of criminals who engage in more violence, more lawlessness, and it becomes a vicious cycle. Did we see that happen in this past year? And did that result in hundreds, at least hundreds, if not a few thousand more murders over the course of the last 12 months than would have otherwise happened? That's a question that I'm sure the media is not going to ask anytime soon, but we should ask, because the truth of the Black Lives Matter movement is something that we shouldn't just allow the left to pretend is an established fact. Did it make anything better for anyone? I've always said Black Lives Matter made everything worse for everyone, including minorities and people that were allegedly being supported by this movement. The data certainly supports me. We'll continue to look at it. You got more executive orders from the Biden administration, this time targeting America's border. We're going to take a look at the shakeup of U.S. immigration policy, thanks to good old blue-collar Joe with Center for Immigration Studies' Mark Cricorian when we come back. President Biden continues his executive order frenzy, setting a record early in his presidency with a total of 47 orders in action signed in just the last 2 weeks. Yesterday's focus was immigration. Biden signed 3 new orders targeting former President Trump's work along the border, and which he said needs to be rolled back.
There's a lot of talk, with good reason, about the number of executive orders that I've signed. I'm not making new law. I'm eliminating bad policy. The last president of the United States issued executive orders I thought were very counterproductive to our security, counterproductive to who we are as a country.
Joining me now to break this down, Mark Cricorian, Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies. Mark, always good to see you.
Thank you.
Tell me, in this new Biden flurry of executive orders, there are a few things. We've got a few of them laid out for folks at home. Task force to reunify families, strategy to address irregular migration, create a human asylum system, and a 3-part plan for safe, lawful, and orderly migration. Let's start, there you go on the screen there. Let's start with the top one, because we heard a lot about this. Separated families, that children were never reunified with their families, and this was talked about as a human rights violation of the Trump administration. What really went on here? What's going on? I mean, nobody actually wants kids to be separated from their parents. What happened?
Well, actually, in some cases, the parents prefer it. This is a holdover from an earlier policy. It's too long to go into, but they were under the Trump administration. Illegal immigrants who brought kids with them were being prosecuted because it's a crime to cross illegally. The kids aren't prosecuted because they're kids. So that ended up putting them into foster care. Most of them were delivered to relatives, but it was badly run, and there were kids who fell between the cracks. But in following up, what they found is that most of those kids, they found the parents. The parents are back in the old country. They don't want the kids to be sent back. The parents are the ones who are insisting those families stay split, except on one condition. They're willing to be reunified with their kids if we fly them if we fly the parents into the United States. And that's almost certainly what's going to end up happening under Biden.
So that in some cases, you're telling me, Mark, children who were separated from their parents but stayed in the U.S., stayed in the system, so to speak, their parents, who were illegal immigrants into the country, went back to Central America in this case, and are essentially using this as a bargaining chip, saying, yeah, we want to be reunited when you bring us back to America. That's what's going on?
That's kind of what it boils down to. It's only a few hundred cases, but yes, that's what it amounts to. I mean, the only reason this is even highlighted in an executive order is that it's a political cudgel the other side is using. I mean, literally, we're talking about a few hundred cases.
And then the strategy to address irregular migration, as Biden lays it out. That sounds like it leaves a lot of open territory, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the point is we're going to deal with the reasons people are coming illegally. That's what they're saying. And there's two parts to that. One is hector those governments to be less corrupt. We're supposedly going to give them aid, and giving aid is going to make them less corrupt, which is ridiculous. I mean, if we could do that kind of thing, the world would already be fixed. We've been trying to do foreign aid for, 75 years now? It hasn't done a lot of good. The other half of this supposedly limiting illegal immigration in this executive order is to just bring more people here legally, to fly them in under something called the Central American Minors Program, where under Obama, we basically just brought the children of illegal immigrants in the United States here to join them on our tab. So this is not in any way going to succeed in limiting the number of people from Central America coming in. All it's going to do, some of it is basically for show to say that we're trying to fix the root problem. It says root problem like 5 times in this order. And the other half of it is just bring them here, fly them in here legally, preferably in the middle of the night so nobody notices.
We were talking just a moment ago about how even though, as you point out, it's hundreds of cases, not even thousands of cases, but hundreds of cases of continued family separation, it is used in political discussions constantly. Here's what Joe Biden said about it earlier this week.
We're going to work to undo the moral and national shame of the previous administration that literally, not figuratively, ripped children from the arms of their families, their mothers and fathers at the border, and with no plan, none whatsoever, to reunify the children who are still in custody and their parents.
So the Biden administration has also put out in their border plan talking points here, create a humane asylum system. What does that actually look like? Or it says human asylum system on our screen there, but what does that look like?
What it means is everybody gets in who says they, are seeking asylum. The reason what happened was when the asylum system was spinning out of control, really, was because people were coming in, they were saying the magic words that they feared persecution in their home country. They were coached on what to say by smugglers and by American lawyers, and they were just released into the United States with a hearing date at some point, many months, maybe even years in the future. Some of them showed up for those hearings, but none of them. Do we know
the percentages, Mark, by the way? Because I know it was some showed, but a lot didn't. Do we have some sense of what the overall percentage was of those who actually?
We don't have an exact percentage. Well, we do actually have a decent percentage of some of the numbers. Something like 75 to 80% of people who said they feared persecution passed the first cut, which is called a credible fear interview with very low standard. Basically, are you getting messages from Mickey Mouse through your dental work? I mean, it's almost that bad. So of those 75 or 80% of the original group, half of them never even bothered to apply for asylum because they were released into the country in order to apply for asylum.
Which
Half
was the whole point, right?
It was just a gimmick.
Yeah,
and of the other half, almost all of them were turned down for asylum. Almost none of them leave.
So, Mark, another thing that came up this week, and I just have to, I find this so interesting. We got a Daily Caller headline on this one, that the DOJ has targeted Elon Musk's SpaceX for allegedly preferring to hire U.S. citizens. I think to a lot of people, myself included, you read this, you say, hold on a second. Isn't it fine to prefer to hire U.S. citizens in America? Turns out that's an issue.
It sure is. And it's even worse. It wasn't just American citizens, because what they're saying is that Elon Musk refused to hire somebody who was neither a U.S. citizen nor a green card holder. In other words, this was somebody on one of the gimmicky, frankly, semi-legal guest worker programs, probably something called OPT, and they didn't hire him. And yet, supposedly, anybody who has work authorization, you have to hire, even in a sensitive technology like this. It's kind of ridiculous, and it is telling, because under the Trump administration, the Justice Department's same office punished a number of employers for discriminating against American workers in favor of foreign workers. So it's pretty clear what's going on.
Yeah, and America last immigration policy from the Biden administration. No surprise on that one. Mark, always appreciate your work. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, we're getting ready for our rapid fire look at stories we got to hit, but only have a little bit of time for, so that's going to be quick hits up next. These days, being prepared for the unknown is more important than ever. I'm sure you've noticed the world we live in is anything but predictable, and we can all benefit from something reliable right about now. Well, what could be more reliable than real gold and silver? I'm talking about real gold and silver you can actually hold right in your hands. Call the Oxford Gold Group right now. Learn how easy it is to get real gold and silver sent securely directly to your home, or how you can have real gold and silver placed in your IRA or 401k. Oxford's who I get my gold and silver from. It's who you should trust too. Just call the Oxford Gold Group right now, 833-600-GOLD, and ask for your free guide on owning gold and silver. Don't wait for inflation to kick up. Don't wait for a huge stock market correction. Take action today to protect your wealth in an uncertain financial world. Again, call the Oxford Gold Group at 833-600-GOLD. The Oxford Gold Group is the only gold company I trust. Call them right now at 833-600-GOLD, 833-600-GOLD. President Biden tries to defend his executive order spree, and some on the far left are now taking issue with Bernie Sanders' casual look at the inauguration. Those stories are coming up on tonight's Quick Hits. Let's start it off with President Biden. You remember that it was not long ago, in fact, just a few months ago, that Joe Biden told us, when he was still a candidate, of course, that rule by executive order is not something that should be done. That's not cool. You don't rule by executive order. Well, that didn't last very long, because here he is on his executive orders.
There's a lot of talk, with good reason, about the number of executive orders that I've signed. I'm not making new law. I'm eliminating bad policy. What I'm doing is taking on the issues that 99% of them, that the last president of the United States issued executive orders I thought were very counterproductive to our security, counterproductive to who we are as a country, particularly in the area of immigration. This is about how America is safer, stronger, more prosperous when we have a fair, orderly, and humane legal immigration system.
Yeah, so when he signs an executive order, it's not really like making law. He's undoing the other executive orders, also some new ones, but it's the good stuff that he's doing, so it doesn't really count. It's not tyrant stuff, no. Trump signs an executive order on naming a post office somewhere, and the media acts like he's the second coming of Stalin. But Joe Biden, more executive orders in his first 2 weeks than any other president before him by far, and he wants to tell us, oh, come on, that's just the way it's got to be. Now, there's a story that's not probably on your radar. I always find it interesting when this pops up, because in some places across the country, usually in large cities, they have either they call it a gifted and talented program in the public school system, or they have some specialized test that you take for entrance into a particularly elite, essentially a school for the gifted, that is all funded by public school dollars, and it is just part of the public school system, but it's merit-based. This creates problems because there are disparities. In fact, there is a disproportionate impact on different communities, and one community really benefits a whole lot from privilege, apparently, the Asian American community, which dramatically outperforms other groups on exams like this in New York, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco. And in San Francisco right now, they're trying to get rid of the test for one such school Here is a board member for that San Francisco school system explaining to you why having a test that anyone can take and that it's just based on admission to the schools, just based on the outcome of this test, well, that's Trumpian and racist. Play it.
When we talk about merit, meritocracy, and especially meritocracy based on standardized testing, I'm just going to say it. In this day and age, we cannot mince words. Those are racist systems. Well, if you're going to say that merit, is like fair, it's the antithesis of fair, and it's the antithesis of just. And so, you can't use equity, or you can't, talk about social justice.
Merit is the antithesis of fair. Okay. But they are trying to get rid of this, and they probably will get rid of this gifted and talented school, or school for the gifted, in San Francisco. As I said, it's white privilege at work in that school that has resulted in it being 70% plus Asian American. That's right, 70% plus Asian American, but it's somehow white privilege or Trumpian. That's, the libs, they don't even make arguments anymore. They just freak out about things, then we all have to listen because, Trump and insurrection and Hitler or some nonsense. Denzel Washington, one of the finest actors in America, one of my favorite actors, quite honestly, of all time, gets an extra check in the plus column here as well because he likes police and law enforcement.
I have the utmost respect for what they do, for what our soldiers do that sacrifice their lives. I'm directing a movie now about a soldier that makes the ultimate sacrifice. And I just don't care for people that put those kinds of people down. If it weren't for them, we would not have the freedom to complain about what they do.
Isn't it fascinating that he's an outlier within the Hollywood community for being willing to say that? What's the far more self-interested and the more popular way to approach law enforcement, to speak about law enforcement when you're a Hollywood elite? I mean, Denzel Washington's worth tens of millions of dollars at a minimum. He's one of the most famous actors in America and in the world. So how would other actors probably speak about the police? They'd start to talk about, oh, that's right, systemic racism, and the system is unjust, and, Black Lives Matter, and they do all this sort of stuff. Denzel's just saying, no, I actually support law enforcement and the military. And that feels like it's a rarity among those who are Hollywood elites these days. So a tip of the hat to him. Jen Psaki Bomb. She doesn't love us Trump supporters out there, or former Trump supporters. I don't know if you still are, if you can't vote for him or support him anymore in office. But she tweeted this. This was an old Psaki tweet, I'm sorry. Trump supporters are the worst, no question. Just thought it was interesting, she mentioned. This is from a while back. What is this? February 11th of 2020. Oh, well, yeah, that's about a year ago. Trump supporters are the worst. Oh, yes. That's our new White House press secretary, everybody. Can't you feel all the unity, all the healing, all the coming together? That's it for tonight's Hold the Line. The No Spin News with Mr. Bill O'Reilly is up next.